The Forest of Disappearances. In the heart of the dense wilderness, far from the nearest town, lies a place cloaked in an impenetrable fog, a place spoken of only in hushed tones. The locals, with their knowing glances and quiet warnings, call it the Forest of Disappearances. The stories are as old as the forest itself, murmured to newcomers by wary eyes. It is a place where the trees grow unnaturally close, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, where the sun seldom breaks through the thick canopy, casting an eternal twilight upon the land. And it is here that people vanish. No one who has entered the forest has ever returned, at least not in the same form they once were. But this, of course, did not deter those who sought adventure. A group of 6 friends, Naomi, Ethan, Sarah, Ben, Lucas, and Isabel, were drawn to the legend like moths to a flame. They were seasoned hikers, lovers of the wild, and they laughed off the warnings as old folklore meant to scare children. Their backpacks were heavy with provisions, and their spirits were high, their youthful optimism clouding the dangers that lay ahead. They set off early one morning, the mist still clinging to the hills as they approached the edge of the forest. The ground beneath their boots was damp, and the air had a heavy, earthy scent. The trees towered over them, their bark dark and thick, their roots twisting like veins into the earth. The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around them, the silence becoming oppressive. It was as though the trees were watching them, listening, waiting. They laughed and joked, to dispel the creeping unease that slowly settled over them. Ethan, always the skeptic, scoffed at the idea of the forest being haunted. "It's just an old myth," he said. "Nothing more than campfire stories." But Sarah, ever the sensitive one, felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something about this place, something wrong. The trees seemed to be shifting in the periphery of her vision, their twisted limbs creaking as if whispering secrets to each other. She could have sworn she heard faint murmurs, like distant voices carried on the wind. But when she stopped to listen, there was only the wind rustling through the leaves. As they ventured deeper, the sunlight began to fade, swallowed by the dense canopy above. A heavy mist rolled in, thick and choking, reducing visibility to mere feet. The air grew colder, a chill creeping into their bones that no amount of movement seemed to shake off. "This is it," Naomi said with a nervous laugh, glancing back at the others. "This is the spot. They say the disappearances happen right around here." She pulled out a map, but it was useless, the lines blurred by time and distance. "That's all nonsense," Ben replied, but his voice lacked conviction. His eyes were scanning the trees, his shoulders tense as though something was watching them. They pressed on, the path growing narrower and the air growing colder still. The sounds of the forest were muffled, as if the very earth itself had swallowed any trace of life. Only the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the rustle of leaves interrupted the silence. And then, as though the forest itself were alive, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and they found themselves walking in circles. No matter which way they turned, the trees appeared the same, the trail indistinguishable from the one they had left behind. Naomi stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. "Has anyone noticed?" she began. But before she could finish, the others fell silent, their eyes scanning the surrounding trees. There it was again, the whisper. It was faint, but unmistakable. It sounded like someone was calling her name. "Naomi," the voice whispered, just at the edge of her hearing. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning to the others, but none of them had heard it. They were all staring at her, their faces pale and wide-eyed. "It's nothing," Lucas said quickly, his voice strained. "Just the wind." But Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that someone, Something was watching them. The air felt oppressive, thick with a presence they could not see. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Naomi. She spun around, but there was nothing. The mist seemed to be closing in on them, thick and heavy, and the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The rustling leaves, the distant bird calls, all were gone. It was as though the world had held its breath. "I don't like this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to retrace their steps, the forest seemed to change around them. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that blocked their path. The trail they had followed had disappeared, swallowed by the ever-thickening fog. The whisper came again, but this time it was not just Naomi's name. It was the voices of the others, calling to them, taunting them. Ethan, Sarah, Ben. It was as if the forest had claimed their very souls, each voice echoing in their minds, distant yet so clear. The friends exchanged panicked glances, but before they could speak, a chill ran through them. A sudden, bone-deep cold that froze them in place. The air shimmered before them, and for a brief moment, they saw something. Figures moving just at the edge of the mist. Shadows, not quite human, but twisted forms that shifted and writhed like something unnatural. "What is that?" Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. The figures grew closer, moving with an unnatural speed. And then, without warning, they were gone, vanished into the mist, leaving behind nothing but a sense of deep, suffocating dread. "Run!" Naomi screamed, her voice raw with terror. And without thinking, they all turned and fled. But no matter how fast they ran, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around them. The whispers grew louder now, a cacophony of voices, all calling their names, urging them forward. But each step they took seemed to draw them deeper into the forest, farther from the world they knew. The trees stretched toward them, their branches reaching like fingers, grasping for them. And then, in the blink of an eye, it happened. Ben, who had been running ahead, vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, gone. No scream, no sign. Just the empty space where he had been. "Ben!" Ethan shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the forest. There was no reply. "Ben!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. But there was no response. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others before him. And though they screamed his name into the mist, the whispers grew louder, mocking them. In a panic, they turned back, trying to retrace their steps, but the forest shifted again, as if it were alive, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. They were no longer sure which direction led out, or if they were simply walking in circles. The trees loomed over them, taller and darker now, and the oppressive silence pressed down on them. And then Naomi heard it again, her name, faint and distant. Naomi. Her heart stopped. She spun around, but this time it wasn't the forest calling her. It was something else, something far worse. A cold, familiar presence at her back. She turned, and there, standing in the mist, was Ben. But he was not the same. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and twisted. He did not speak, only watched them with an empty gaze, his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice hollow, his words like ice. And then, with a sudden rush, the forest moved. The trees closed in, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and everything went black. The next morning, the search parties arrived. They found the clearing where the hikers had entered, but there was no sign of them, no tracks, no belongings. The forest, as it always had, remained still, its secrets buried deep within the twisted roots of the ancient trees. Some say the forest hungers for those who venture too far, that it calls to those who listen too closely, beckoning them into the darkness. Others say it is a place where time bends, and those who enter never truly leave. But one thing remains certain. The forest of disappearances still waits, and the whispers of those who vanished can still be heard, carried on the wind, forever calling. The Mirror Ritual. Summoning the Other Self. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale silver beams across the still world below. A heavy fog lingered in the air, soft and dense, creeping through the streets like an ancient secret long forgotten. Inside a small apartment nestled in a quiet corner of the city, Lily sat at her vanity, her eyes fixed on the large, ornate mirror in front of her. The mirror was old, older than any piece of furniture she owned. It had been passed down from her grandmother, whose strange stories and rituals were known to be whispered around the family table. Those who dared to ask too many questions about the mirror were quickly shushed, the conversation changing as swiftly as a passing storm. Lily had never truly believed in her grandmother's tales, her warnings of shadowy figures, whispers in the dead of night, and strange reflections that were not quite her own. But the unease that had always accompanied the mirror had slowly faded into the background of her life. It sat, unmoving, in the corner of her bedroom, reflecting back the mundane tasks of her existence, brushing her hair, putting on makeup, gazing at her own reflection. It had been an unremarkable object, until one night when Lily stumbled across a faded page in one of her grandmother's journals. The page was marked with ink smeared by time and age, but Lily could still make out the words, faint but chilling. To see yourself, you must first call upon your other. The mirror will reveal what is hidden in the deepest corners of your soul. But beware, for it is not always a reflection you will meet. The ritual is only to be performed under the gaze of the full moon, at the hour of midnight. A warning to all. Never ask the mirror for what you cannot bear to see. It had been weeks since she had read the words, and they had haunted her ever since. A part of her knew better than to experiment with the ritual. Another part, however, was drawn to it. A thirst to see something. Perhaps to understand herself in a way that no one else could. What if the ritual revealed something that would answer her questions about her own life, her own identity? The desire to know, to finally uncover the truth, gnawed at her. And so, as the full moon rose high in the night sky, Lily found herself standing before the mirror once more. The air around her felt charged, as though it too anticipated what was about to unfold. She had followed the instructions in her grandmother's journal to the letter, setting candles around the room, drawing a circle of salt on the floor, and reciting the incantation from the faded page. She was prepared, or so she thought. At the stroke of midnight, Lily took a deep breath, steeling herself. The words tumbled from her lips, shaking slightly as they echoed in the silence of the room. Mirror, mirror, reflect what's true. Show me what I cannot see. Show me the other side of me. The flames of the candles flickered as she finished, and for a brief moment, the room felt unnaturally still. She looked into the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Her reflection gazed back at her, her face as calm and ordinary as it had always been. But then something shifted. Her reflection blinked. No, it didn't blink. It was slower, deliberate, as though it were aware of her, watching her. Lily's breath hitched. It was an odd feeling to stare at yourself and feel that your reflection was doing something different from you. Something wrong. Lily leaned forward, her gaze never leaving the mirror. Her pulse raced. Is this it? She thought. The answer she had been searching for, staring at her through the glass. She waited, almost afraid to move. The reflection of her face, her own face, twitched. A subtle grimace pulled at the corner of her lips, just enough for Lily to notice. And then it happened. The figure in the mirror smiled. It wasn't the soft, hesitant smile that Lily was used to. No, this smile was wide, unsettling, almost mocking. Lily stepped back, her heart racing in her chest. This was not a smile she recognized. "Who are you?" she whispered. Her reflection didn't answer with words. Instead, it tilted its head, the grin stretching wider, and then it did something Lily never expected. It moved. The reflection reached out, pressing its hand against the glass. Lily froze in place. She instinctively lifted her own hand to the mirror, as if drawn by an unseen force, and felt the cold surface beneath her fingertips. But then, the reflection's hand moved faster than her own. It pressed harder, as though it were trying to break through. Lily recoiled, heart pounding in her chest, a surge of fear flooding her veins. The reflection's eyes locked with hers, those eyes, cold and dark, not her own. This was not the gentle face she had known all her life. This was something else, something far darker. "Why did you call me?" The voice that came from the reflection was not her own. It was distorted, deep, hollow, and laced with something that made her blood run cold. It seemed to come not from the mouth of her reflection, but from within her own mind, a whisper that scratched at her thoughts. "I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice quivering with fear. The reflection's grin widened, its eyes narrowing as it leaned closer to the glass. "Oh, but you did mean to. You wanted to see the truth. Now you must face it." Lily stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair behind her. The reflection in the mirror did not follow her movement. It stayed fixed in place, its eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "No!" she cried out. "You're not real! You're just a reflection!" The figure in the mirror gave a low, eerie chuckle. "That's what you think." Before Lily could move, the reflection began to change. The figure's face twisted, its features warping, melting into something monstrous, something not quite human. The eyes, once dark and cold, turned into black pits, sucking in the light around them. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, and the temperature dropped drastically. She could see her breath, short and shallow, escaping in icy clouds as she backed away from the mirror. The reflection's voice became louder, more insistent. "You called me here. You wanted to know what lies beyond your own reflection, to understand the darkness within. But now, you must face the consequences." Lily turned and ran for the door, but before she could reach it, she felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure on her chest, as though invisible hands were gripping her heart, tightening with each beat. Her vision blurred, and the room spun around her. The mirror was calling to her, its voice growing louder, its presence overwhelming. As she stumbled, the world around her seemed to bend, the walls warping and shifting. The reflection in the mirror grew more distorted, until it was no longer just an image. It was a presence, something far more real, and far more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. With a final, desperate cry, Lily reached out to the door, her fingers trembling as she grasped the handle. But as she opened it, the world outside her apartment disappeared. The familiar sights of her home, the hallway, the walls, the very ground beneath her, faded away into darkness. The mirror had claimed her. The stranger who knew everything about me. The cafe was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and deliberate, as though the world itself were holding its breath. I sat at a corner table, my hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. trying to lose myself in the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window. It had been a long week, no, a long year, and I craved the solace of anonymity, the comfort of being just another face in the crowd. But that was before he walked in. The bell above the door jingled softly, and I glanced up, more out of habit than curiosity. He stood there, dripping wet, his dark coat clinging to his tall, lean frame. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, those piercing, unnaturally bright eyes, scanned the room before landing on me. For a moment, I felt a strange pull, a magnetic force that made it impossible to look away. And then he smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. He walked toward me with purpose, his movements fluid and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. I wanted to look away, to bury myself in my book, or pretend to be engrossed in my phone, but I couldn't. There was something about him, something that held me captive, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice smooth and low, like velvet. It wasn't a question so much as a command, and before I could respond, he slid into the chair across from me. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him that I wasn't in the mood for company, but the words died on my lips. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a strange, almost electric sensation, as though he were peering into the very depths of my soul. "You've had a difficult year," he said, his tone matter of fact, as though he were commenting on the weather. "The loss of your mother, the breakup with Daniel, the job you hate but can't afford to quit. It's been overwhelming, hasn't it?" I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. How could he know these things? They weren't secrets exactly, but they weren't things I shared with strangers either. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, his smile widening. "A friend," he said. "Someone who understands you better than you understand yourself." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to have settled over my mind. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice trembling. "How do you know these things?" He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and fixed me with that unnerving gaze. "Because I've been watching you," he said, "for a very long time." The words sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, he continued. "You cry yourself to sleep most nights, though you tell everyone you're fine. You keep a journal hidden under your mattress, filled with all the things you're too afraid to say out loud. And you still have the necklace your mother gave you, the one you wear on special occasions, even though it reminds you of her." My breath caught in my throat. The journal, the necklace, these were things no one could possibly know. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a pocket watch, its surface etched with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change as I stared at them. He placed it on the table between us, and I felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward it. "Do you believe in fate, Emily?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I blinked, startled. "How do you know my name?" He ignored the question, his eyes never leaving mine. "Do you believe that some things are meant to happen, no matter how much we try to avoid them?" I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but it was like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. I don't know," I stammered. He smiled again, that same slow, knowing smile. "You will," he said. "Soon." Before I could say anything else, he stood, his movements graceful and deliberate. He picked up the pocket watch and slipped it back into his coat, his eyes never leaving mine. "We'll meet again," he said. when the time is right. And then he was gone, disappearing into the rain-soaked street as quickly as he had appeared. I sat there, frozen, my mind reeling with questions I couldn't answer. Who was he? How did he know those things about me? And what did he mean by, when the time is right? The days that followed were a blur. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, a figment of my imagination fueled by stress and exhaustion. But the memory of his eyes, those piercing, unnaturally bright eyes, haunted me. I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me with that same knowing smile. And then, one night, he returned. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat and I sat up, my hands trembling. The knock came again, louder this time, and I felt a cold, numbing fear settle in my chest. I approached the door slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who is it?" I called, my voice shaking. "It's me," came the reply, smooth and low like velvet. "We need to talk." I opened the door, my hands trembling, and there he was, standing in the hallway, his dark coat dripping wet, and his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his movements fluid and deliberate, and closed the door behind him. "You've been thinking about me," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Wondering." "The night my baby." Monitor picked up a voice. It wasn't my child. The first night I heard it, I thought I was dreaming. It had been a long, exhausting day. My newborn daughter, Lillian, was barely 3 weeks old, and sleep had become a luxury I could no longer afford. My husband, Mark, worked late shifts at the hospital, leaving me alone in our too large Victorian home with only the crackling silence for company. It was a house with history, a relic of an older time, filled with whispers of those who had come before us. Or so I had begun to think in the quiet hours of the night. I had just settled into bed, the baby monitor resting on my nightstand, its soft static a strange comfort in the darkness. Lillian had finally fallen asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in the gentle glow of her nightlight. I had checked on her twice already, ensuring she was swaddled and warm, before retreating to my own restless sleep. Then, just as the fog of slumber was beginning to pull me under, I heard it. A lullaby. Soft and melodic, a woman's voice drifted through the monitor, singing in a hushed, sorrowful tone. The words were indistinct, foreign even, but the melody sent ice threading through my veins. It was not a song I had ever sung to Lillian, nor one I had heard before. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe the monitor had picked up interference, a neighbor's baby, a rogue radio signal. But as I strained to listen, the singing continued, delicate and deliberate, rocking through the speakers with eerie clarity. And then, a whisper. "Hush now, my sweet one. Sleep, little love." I was out of bed before I could think, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the baby monitor, its screen glowing in the darkness. The image was hazy, but I could see Lillian's crib, her blankets bundled in a soft mound. Yet something was wrong. She wasn't moving. The lullaby hummed on, the voice laced with an aching sorrow. My fingers trembled as I reached for the nursery door, pushing it open with a creak. The dim glow of the nightlight cast long shadows across the room, the rocking chair shifting slightly as though someone had just risen from it. The crib was empty. The blankets were perfectly arranged, untouched, as if she had never been there at all. A breath, soft as silk, brushed against my ear. "You should not have come." I whirled around, my pulse a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. The nursery was empty. I could hear my own breath, ragged and quick, but nothing else. The monitor in my hand fizzled with static, the lullaby fading into silence. Then the softest sound, a baby's cry. From downstairs, I did not think, I only ran. My bare feet pounded against the floorboards as I hurtled down the staircase, my pulse roaring in my ears. The crying grew louder, more desperate, but it was wrong, twisted. As if something was trying to mimic my daughter's wail, but had never heard a real child cry before. I reached the living room, my breath coming in short gasps. The fireplace lay dark and cold, shadows curling in the corners of the room. And then there, in the very center of the floor, Lillian. She was lying on her back, bundled in her blankets, her tiny face scrunched in distress. My hands shook as I scooped her up, clutching her to my chest. She was warm, her little body trembling against mine. Relief crashed over me, but it was short-lived, because someone had put her there, and I had been alone all night. The lullaby started again, soft and crooning, coming not from the monitor, but from just behind me. I did not turn. I did not dare. Instead, I ran, bolting up the stairs and locking the nursery door behind me. I clutched Lillian close, pressing my lips to her forehead as she whimpered against my shoulder. My phone was downstairs. I had no way to call for help. My only option was to wait for morning. The singing continued through the night. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, the voice had faded, leaving only an eerie hush in its wake. When Mark returned that morning, I told him everything, my voice shaking. The tape of tomorrow's terror. The attic had always been a place of mystery and dread, a shadowy realm filled with the detritus of generations past. It was a place where forgotten memories were stored, where the past lingered like a ghost, waiting to be unearthed. I had avoided it for years, content to let its secrets remain buried. But on that fateful day, curiosity got the better of me. The storm had been raging for hours, the wind howling like a banshee and the rain hammering against the roof, and I found myself drawn to the attic, as though some unseen force were pulling me toward it. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light from the single bulb cast long, twisted shadows on the walls. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, their groans echoing through the empty space like the whispers of the dead. I moved cautiously, my eyes scanning the piles of boxes and old furniture, searching for something, anything, that might explain the strange pull I had felt. And then I saw it. Tucked away in a corner, beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers and moth-eaten blankets, was a small, unmarked box. It was nondescript, the kind of box that might have held old photographs or childhood mementos, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid, and inside I found a single VHS tape. The tape was unlabeled, its surface a dull, matte black that seemed to absorb the light. There was no title, no indication of what it might contain, but as I turned it over in my hands, I noticed something etched into the plastic, a date. It was tomorrow's date. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold, numbing fear settle in my chest. How could this be? How could a tape in my attic be labeled with tomorrow's date? I told myself it was a coincidence, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it was something more, something sinister. I carried the tape downstairs, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind rattling the windows and the rain pounding against the roof, but I barely noticed. My attention was focused on the tape, its presence a constant weight in my hands. I found an old VCR in the basement, its surface coated in a thick layer of dust, and hooked it up to the television in the living room. The screen flickered to life, its static-filled glow casting an eerie light on the room. I inserted the tape, my hands trembling, and pressed play. The screen went black for a moment, and then an image appeared. It was grainy, the colors washed out and the edges blurred, but I could make out a figure lying on the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was me. I was lying on the floor of my living room, my body twisted at an unnatural angle. My eyes were wide with terror, and my mouth was open in a silent scream. There was blood, so much blood, pooling beneath me, staining the carpet a deep, dark red. And standing over me was a figure, tall and shadowy, its face obscured by the grainy footage. The camera zoomed in, and I saw the weapon in the figure's hand, a knife, its blade glinting in the dim light. The figure raised the knife, its movements slow and deliberate, and brought it down in a swift, brutal arc. I watched in horror as the blade plunged into my chest, the blood spurting from the wound and splattering the camera lens. The screen went black, and the tape ended. I sat there, frozen, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. What had I just seen? How could a tape in my attic show my own murder, with tomorrow's date etched into its surface? It didn't make sense, and yet I couldn't deny what I had seen. The image of my lifeless body, the blood, the shadowy figure. It was burned into my mind, a nightmare I couldn't escape. I ejected the tape, my hands trembling, and stared at it, as though it might provide some explanation. But it was just a tape. A simple, unassuming object that held a horror beyond comprehension. I wanted to destroy it, to throw it into the fire and watch it burn, but something stopped me. Some part of me needed to know more, to understand what was happening. I spent the rest of the night in a state of terror, my eyes fixed on the tape, as though it might come to life and attack me. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling like a banshee and the rain hammering against the roof, but I barely noticed. My mind was consumed with thoughts of the tape, of the gruesome scene it had shown me, and of the shadowy figure who had taken my life. When the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, I felt a small measure of relief. But the fear remained, a constant weight on my chest, and I knew that I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I had to find out more, to uncover the truth behind the tape and the horrifying future it had shown me. I spent the day researching, scouring the internet for any information that might explain what I had seen. But there was nothing. No mention of cursed tapes, no stories of people seeing their own deaths. It was as though the tape existed outside of reality, a fragment of some nightmare that had somehow found its way into my attic. As the hours passed, the fear grew, until it was a living, breathing thing, a presence that filled the house and pressed against me from all sides. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything other than the tape, but it was impossible. The image of my lifeless body, the blood, the shadowy figure, it haunted me, a constant reminder of the horror that awaited me. And then, as the sun began to set, I heard a sound, a soft, insistent tapping at the door. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, my eyes fixed on the door. The tapping came again, louder this time, and I felt a cold, numbing fear settle in my chest. I approached the door slowly, my hands trembling, and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and looked around. The street was empty, save for the rain-soaked pavement and the flickering streetlights. But as I turned to go back inside, I saw something, a shadow, moving in the corner of my vision. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. I closed the door and locked it, my hands trembling, and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. But the fear remained. a constant weight on my chest, and I knew that the shadowy figure from the tape was here, in my house, waiting for the right moment to strike. I spent the rest of the night in a state of terror, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the figure to appear. But it didn't come. The hours passed, the storm continued to rage, and I felt myself growing more and more exhausted until I could no longer keep my eyes open. I drifted into a restless sleep, my dreams filled with the same shadows and whispers as before. And then, at 3:17 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they were there. Footsteps, moving through the house, coming closer and closer to my room. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened, my ears straining to hear every sound. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I felt a cold, numbing fear settle in my chest. The doorknob turned slowly, the sound echoing through the silent house, and the door creaked open. The shadowy figure stood there, its face obscured by the darkness, its body tall and lean. It stepped into the room, its movements slow and deliberate, and I felt a cold, malevolent energy radiating from it. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, as though held in place by some unseen force. The figure approached the bed, its eyes gleaming in the dim light, and raised the knife, its blade glinting in the darkness. And then, just as the blade came down, I woke up. I was lying in bed, my body drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent, save for the sound of my own breathing, and I felt a cold, numbing fear settle in my chest. It had been a dream, just a dream, but it had felt so real, so vivid, that I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than that. I got out of bed and went to the living room, my hands trembling as I turned on the light. The tape was still there, sitting on the coffee table, its surface gleaming in the dim light. I picked it up, my mind racing with fear and confusion, and knew that I had to destroy it. I took the tape outside, the rain soaking through my clothes, and threw it into the fire pit. I poured gasoline over it and lit a match, watching as the flames consumed the tape, its surface melting and warping in the heat. But as the flames died down, I saw something. A figure standing in the shadows, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. It was the shadowy figure from the tape, its presence a constant weight on my chest, and I knew that it wasn't over. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and I felt a cold, malevolent energy radiating from it. It raised the knife, its blade glinting in the darkness, and I knew that I was out of time. The last thing I saw was the blade, coming down in a swift, brutal arc, and then everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of my living room, my body twisted at an unnatural angle. My eyes were wide with terror, and my mouth was open in a silent scream. There was blood, so much blood, pooling beneath me, staining the carpet a deep, dark red. And standing over me was the shadowy figure, its face obscured by the darkness, its eyes gleaming with a cold, malevolent light. It raised the knife, its movements slow and deliberate, and brought it down in a swift, brutal arc. The blade plunged into my chest, the pain searing and unbearable, and I felt my life slipping away. And then, just as the screen had shown, everything went black. The tape was real. The future it had shown me